All right, welcome everybody. Today's presentation, we're going to do a topic on senses and scent communication of the white-tailed deer. A little bit about myself. My name is Eric Lance. I'm a wildlife biologist here in Northeast Ohio. I work for a ecological consulting company to where I do a lot of wildlife management services. And I also own and operate Buckeye Wildlife Consultants, which is a private landowner-based wildlife management company that specializes in pretty much everything from urban wildlife to rural whitetail management and pretty much, again, all aspects of whitetail management and wildlife management. So let's get started here with the presentation a little bit. Today's seminar is primarily going to be for the understanding of how deer use their senses to communicate with each other and with other individuals within the population. We're going to go in and talk about the differences between the use of these as deer being prey species and as versus predatory species. What this means is we'll be talking about, like I said, the difference between how deer use their primary senses as prey species versus what we would use our senses as a predatory species. So another thing we're going to look at and remember is that today's topic is going to primarily be on the basic understanding of these. We don't want to take a whole time and looking at the complete, anatomical and physiological changes that happen within all of these things, because we would be here for years. So we're going to get it to the most basic level of understanding so you guys can comprehend what I'm talking about a little bit easier. One thing to remember is that hunting is an $850 million industry a year, just as far as the hunting itself, especially here in Ohio. That generates a lot of money for game lands and things of that nature. Out of that $859 million, the whitetail make up probably well more than half of that. One thing that's interesting to note is that out of that $859 million, along with them being the majority shareholder of that the white-tailed deer is actually the largest, or the most widely studied large game mammal in the entire world. Primarily because of how much money it generates in the hunting industry, the automobile industry, as far as car damage is what we all know. And then secondly, it's even used for some studies in cancer research. Antler development is highly studied for cancer research because of how fast it grows, is one thing that they're looking at there. And again, this is just reiterating what I just said. One of the things before we get started here is I like everyone to sit back and think and always have people kind of visualize, what do deer think about while they're walking through the woods. All right, there are three things primarily that white-tailed deer, along with other wildlife, what they think about. And what these three things are is that, number one, where do I find food? Number two, how do I keep from being food? And number three, how do I make another copy of myself, or how do I reproduce? These three questions right here, okay, fall under every aspect of the deer's biology and physiology. So everything that we know and understand is based on these three questions right here. So everything we talk about today is going to relate to these three questions. So keep that in mind. Another thing to really kind of understand is that things that we know today about the white-tailed deer aren't necessarily everything that we know. There are things that we know a lot about. There are things that we don't know a lot about. There are things that we have hypothesis on or ideas on based on cross-examination of closely related species or other wildlife species that have the same types of structures that we're looking at. So again, we talked about predator versus prey species here. Predatory species use their senses. We're primarily a scent-oriented species, a sight-oriented species. So, it'd be pretty hard to deal for the most part if we lost our sense of sight. But is that the case for deer? No. Okay, the deer's primary sense is their sense of smell, okay, which is what we're going to talk about a lot today. So keep that in mind just a little bit, just as a general rule. Then we'll kind of move on here and get things going. Keep going here. University of Deer Labs, are really where we find most of what we know about the white-tailed deer, along with field research, but a lot of it comes with these deer labs that universities have. University of Georgia, University of Mississippi, to those nature. A lot of these schools have these big deer labs that go ahead and try to learn as much as we possibly can. Like I said earlier, there's much we still don't know, there's much that we do know, and there's just some that we have an idea about. Now, until we can actually find a deer that can talk and we can sit down and interview, all right, there's not going to be any way for sure that we can really tell 100% of what's really going on. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about, what we know in mainstream science as a whole on whitetail biology and how they use their senses. Okay, so let's get into it here a little bit. The sense of touch, as you can see. The sense of touch, you know, it works identical to how our sense of touch does. All right, you have your peripheral nervous system and your nerves that are out towards the, you know, sensing the environment around us and relaying those signals to the brain for translation. The important thing that I want to notice here, that we're going to talk about the sense of touch. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we're going to talk about two structures. And if you look at the pictures here, you see two of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about this antler velvet right here that deer have, and then these long eyelashes that you see that the whitetail has. And those are what we call the vibrissae. Okay, now let's talk about those first. The thing with these is that we all know that deer are foragers, browsers, grazers, you know, depending on what they're feeding on, their head is always down in the vegetation. What these eyelashes are used for is these long eyelashes are sensory organs that are designed to feel around and kind of feel if there's any potential threat to the eye, any danger, you know, a stick, a broken twig, anything of that nature that could harm the deer's eye. So that's what those are for. And you see these on other species of wildlife, you know, antelope, cows, horses, you know, all other species. A lot of them have these structures. Now the big thing with the sense of touch is the actual antler itself when it's grown in velvet. As we all know, antler velvet is consistent of what? Okay, it's obviously got, we know it has a high amount of blood vessels. These blood vessels supply all of the required nutrients that the antler needs to keep growing. Well, another thing is how it relates to sense of touch is that these antlers, ever wonder why each year the buck will keep the same framework, okay, maybe bigger, maybe, you know, smaller. That plays into soil quality that we know has a large influence on antler development. But all in all, the structure is actually generally the same. And the reason for this is because of what we call innervation. And the innervation is the framework that we also find inside this antler development of these highly specialized nerve cells that are the blueprint of how this antler is going to grow every year. So what happens is every year when the antlers are shed and grown and vice versa, what happens is that framework is stored into a part of the brain and it's regrown every year. So obviously that's another reason why, you know, deer are very, very touchy as far as when their antlers are developed, because they don't want to damage that framework. All right, so, you know, a lot of times when you see deer with antler deformities, it doesn't always mean, you know, genetics are in play. There could be other factors. You know, there could be injuries to the legs that we know cause some antler deformities, but it could also be some type of damage done in this antler development or this velvet stage. Okay, so like I said, I don't want to talk a lot about the sense of touch because it works primarily of what we do, or the way that ours does. Now, the sense of taste is pretty much another thing that we're not going to spend a whole lot of time about, because the sense of taste, there's not been a lot of research as far as how deer taste, because it works identical to how ours does. You know, the sense of smell, the sense of taste, it all plays with each other. So the mechanism is the same, and I'll show this in a slide when we start talking about the sense of smell. Is it different than ours? Probably yes, but not in the sense of how it actually works. It's different mainly because they probably have the ability of tasting things more strongly than we do, just because we know that the sense of taste is actually tied into the sense of smell. Okay, you know, the taste buds that we have, bittersweet, sour, and salty. Okay, so obviously, you know, those are what the taste receptors are. So when they're eating other things like that, how do they know what it is? Well, the sense of smell comes into play as far as that goes. So we know deer have a highly refined sense of smell, so it's safe to assume, you know, that they have a really good refined sense of taste.